So what about Isaiah 53? Because I do feel like I've studied Isaiah a fair amount. So I'd be interested.
You
So
want to
you
just have a
said
discussion on it? We can. Can I bring up some? I can't control your screen, but
no, I'll
I can
pull it up on the screen. I'm gonna be.
Here's what I would ask you though.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Finish your.
Oh no, I was just gonna say
get into this.
I'm gonna be looking at my physical Bible a lot, so just bear with me on that. But let me know when you want something.
Which one? What Bible are you using?
I have an ESV Bible.
I think it's important to start in earlier passages because they actually tell you who the servant is.
Yeah.
So if you look at 41:8,
41:8,
like Isaiah 41:8 and 41:9.
You want me to pull it up on the screen or?
Yeah, if you could, and we can get to 53 eventually. Yeah. But if you look at 41:8 to 9, that would be one to look at. So yeah, like if you look at 8, but you Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, the offspring of Abraham, my friend. Like it's using who's the servant here? It's Israel, Jacob.
8. Yeah.
Yeah. And then it gives you context in 9, you whom I have took from the ends of the earth and called in the farthest corners, saying to you, you are my servant, I have chosen you and not cast you off.
Yep.
Right. Then if you look at 43:10.
Yeah. And by the way, I agree that's but can we go through a little bit, because I'd like to stop at 42.
Sure.
So there I totally agree, that's the servant. And just to set this up, like basically my general contention is that I think what makes the most sense of Isaiah is interpreting it as there are two servants in view, Israel being God's chosen servant that has failed their mission, and then an ideal servant that's spoken of as an individual coming to fulfill this mission for Israel as God's righteous servant. Just so you know where I'm coming from. So for 42,
well, he applies. He speaks within these passages, both plural and singular, to Israel. But I'll show you that in a second. But
yeah. Give me 1 sec. So 42.
Sure.
Then let me stop there, and then I'll go to 43. A couple things here. 42:4. It says the coastlands will wait for his law, and that's talking about the servant up here. And so if you go to 51:5, which I'm not going to flip to, but 51:5 says that the coastlands hope for me, and that's the Lord talking. And for my arm they wait. And so there I'm just pointing to that, this is a hint, in my opinion, that this is the same, that God is the servant.
Hi, Colin.
Another thing is...
Wait. Well, so they wait for his arm. The use of God's arm is throughout that language. Like that's what's going to bring it, them out. That's a reference to God, using his power to bring them out.
God's arm is God's
so
power,
it says
God's
that
action.
It says that the coastlands will wait for his law, meaning the servant. And then in 51, it says, for a law will go out from me, meaning God.
Well,
and it says the coastlands will hope for me, and for my arm they wait. So it's very similar language for both the servant and for God, which I just think is interesting if you have Jesus as an incarnate God in view.
Well, let's go to 43 real quick.
Well, let me hit a couple other things. I can get your thoughts on all of them, or I can just go through them. You don't have to give me your thoughts on all of them. Let me see here. So in verse 6, it says, "I've called you in righteousness. I will take you by the hand and keep you. I will give you as a covenant for the people, a light for the nations."
By the way, for 1 second, I do want to get one thing on it. What do you think of 45:1? Because 45:1 to me is a clear. This is relevant to these other things, especially to what you just put up here. It's Cyrus. Cyrus is the Messiah in these passages.
Right.
He's the one who fulfills all these things. Not Jesus. It's Cyrus.
The king. Cyrus the king.
He's the one who let them go, who freed them. He was the one acting as the anointed by God to do it.
Yeah,
and so he fulfills some what you just pointed out, about his law and so forth, and bringing them out. That's
right. So I would agree that. But for one, it sounded like before you were saying your main idea is that Israel is the servant, but
the servant. But that's different from like
the Messiah.
The Messiah.
Who doesn't believe in God is
the suffering servant. Yeah.
Yeah. So obviously, I would equate them, but I mean, if we keep focused on the servant, then I guess it's not really all that relevant because 42 is about the servant, whereas Cyrus is about the Messiah. But I would agree that Cyrus is a type of Jesus, like a type of Christ. Like he is a Messiah, but I don't think he can fulfill everything that God says about the servant in Isaiah. And I think you'd probably agree since you think the servant is Israel.
Well, I think, it says the servant is Israel. It says multiple times.
It does. It does. No, I agree.
Where it tells you who the servant is.
Yeah.
It doesn't say that the servant is Cyrus. It says the anointed is Cyrus.
Let me just hit one.
That's 45:1.
Let me hit one other important verse in 42, and then we can go to what you wanted to talk about in 43. Mm-hmm. So I think one really important thing is that the servant in 42 is going to open the eyes of the blind, bring out the prisoners from the dungeon, bring out those who sit in darkness, etc. But then in verses 18 to 20, it says, "Hear you deaf, and look you blind, that you may see. Who is blind but my servant, or deaf as my messenger whom I send?" And so, to me, this is... I can't see this,
Pal. Can you move over a little bit? Thanks.
To me, this is an indication that there, in this one chapter alone, the servant both heals the blind, leads the captives out, and is blind, is captive. And so, to me...
Hang on a second. Hang on.
Yeah.
Here, you know what? I don't know if I totally like the ESV. Let me look it up in mine. He said, "Who is blind but my servant?"
Right.
Right. He's saying Israel is not seeing.
Right.
This capacity.
I agree.
Okay.
So here, I think he's talking about Israel, but there appears to be a servant here that opens the eyes of the blind and brings them out of captivity, and this doesn't seem like it's Israel because, as we just agreed, the servant that's Israel is blind and is captive. And so it's at least odd that the servant would be both blind and captive and opening the eyes of the blind and leading out the captives.
Right. So what I think this is talking about, what I think this is actually fulfilled, is that after Israel, who was blind and who committed these things and was being punished in exile, that when they're brought out, when they've paid over twice for their misdeeds, right? And it even goes into that. They paid double, right? And they're brought out, that they would be a light to all the other nations. Mm-hmm. That's the prophecy that we see in this. So that Israel as a nation would serve that function. The servant itself would become that light.
Right. So I guess in this particular instance, like I could see that reading possibly, although it's a little bit weird that that it's the order's reversed, that the servant first sees and then he's blind. But either way, that's a potential reading. But I do think it's interesting that, like, in my reading, there's two different servants. In your reading, it's one servant at two different times. Like, both of us have to make sense of like an oddity in this chapter. And I'm just saying that Jesus fits if you're seeing it as two different servants.
What I'm saying is that overall, of all of Deutero-Isaiah, like at no point because I'm like, it doesn't make sense for this to be Israel Jacob, especially when they say it's Israel Jacob over and over again.
Yeah, we can keep going because I think there are some even clearer passages, but I think that's good to note. So did you want to go to 43?
Let's do 43:10. Because this is critical. This shows the singular and plural forms in relation to Israel.
43.
You are my witnesses, says the Lord, and my servant, singular, whom I have chosen.
Yeah, let me just catch up to here really quick.
Doesn't say servants, because then you can have a compelling argument that wait,
43:10. You are my witnesses, my servant, whom I have chosen. I would agree.
And my servant.
I would agree here.
So it's in that one sentence, he's referring to both as plural and singular.
Right. No, so I would agree here that this is Israel, the nation, most likely.
Yeah. If you look at if you look at 44 1-2,
44.
like Jacob, my servant Israel, whom I have chosen. That's just it's more examples of him referring to.
Wait, 44. You said 44.
1-2. Yeah.
Yeah. Jacob, Israel, whom I've chosen. Yeah, formed you. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I have no problem with that. That being the nation of Israel too.
And all this, and then check this out. Look at 48:20, right?
Hold on, I still want to go through and make sure we don't skip too much. So
sure. I mean, I'm actually skipping a lot of other things. I'm skipping. I just skipped over like 44:21 and 45:4 and all these other references that are kind of relevant. But we could just there's I think numerous examples. I never see Jesus listed here in any of these passages.
Yeah, I'm flipping through. Let me find the next spot that I want to stop.
I want to ask you a question, because we have Judaism like prior to having Christianity, and the people who are first and foremost who should believe who should be convinced about Jesus becoming the Messiah are the Jews, the Jewish people. Right. So how come that the same people who are expecting the Messiah are the one rejecting the Messiah that you are
I would say it's because he didn't fulfill the messianic prophecies. Like when you read Zechariah 9:9 and 9:10, he doesn't fulfill that, or Micah 5:2, or any of those other ones.
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, I could agree with that to some extent. I would say that Jesus didn't fulfill every messianic prophecy as far as bringing in an earthly kingdom, creating world peace, stuff like that. But that's saved for a second return. And that he also, I believe, fulfilled things in the Old Testament that the Jews had not necessarily associated with the Messiah. Because the Jews didn't expect him to be God. And that's what he claimed to be. So obviously,
so the concept of the Messiah being God is totally New Testament. Like that's not what they say about the Messiah in the Old Testament.
Okay, so did you want to go to verse or chapter 48? I'm catching up to you now. I'm just making sure there's nothing important.
48:20. It just kind of
48:20.
Go out. 48:20. Go out from Chaldea, flee from Chaldea. Declare this with a shout of joy. Proclaim it. Send it forth to the end of the earth. Say the Lord has redeemed his servant Jacob.
Yeah.
Right. This is like the context of like coming out of exile.
Yeah.
Like, this is the overarching story.
Yeah. I agree. Again, I agree that this is Israel, the nation of Israel. You want to go to 49?
Yeah, we get 49:3.
I think so. Just to mention here, the interesting thing about 49 is that whereas before you pointed out there are some there is some plural language attached with the servant, from 49 to 53, I believe, there's no more plural language. It's all singular in every instance, from what I know.
Well, it says, wait, hold on. 49:3 in my copy, it says, "You are my servant, Israel, in whom I will be glorified." At least mine, that's what that says. So that's a singular, but it's referring to, it's not Jacob, it's Israel in total. They're the same. Obviously.
Right.
But it's using, but we saw earlier where it's servant was using the singular to apply to Jacob, to Israel.
Right. So yeah, I would say when we get to this point, we could be like, okay, we think we're talking about the nation of Israel here because of how it's been used in the past. I would agree with that. That's what we would think.
We think we're using that because it says Israel in that sentence.
Right. But I think
it doesn't say Jesus.
Right, but I think, and let me show you this verse, and then I can make my point with this. So, verse 5, I think, is a really important verse for my interpretation of this, and it says, "And now the Lord says, He who formed me from the womb is servant, to bring Jacob back to him, and that Israel might be gathered to him. For I am honored in the eyes of the Lord, and my God has become my strength," he says. And then, "It is too light of a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and bring back the preserved of Israel. I will make you as a light for the nations, that my salvation shall reach the ends of the earth." So this one's super interesting because, yes, he's called Israel up here. But down here, the servant is formed in the womb to bring Jacob and Israel back to him, and also is raised up to be a light to the tribes of Jacob and the preserved of Israel, and to bring the Gentiles as well. So let me just kind of tell you how I think my interpretation fits with this is that Jesus is the new servant, which also makes him the new Israel.
Where does it say Jesus in here?
Right. It doesn't say Jesus, but I'm saying it seems like there is a different servant from.
It doesn't. I understand what you're saying, Colin, but what I'm saying is, like, it says over and over again who the servant is or who the Messiah is in these passages. It never says Jesus.
Right. It doesn't say Jesus. All I'm saying here is that the servant seems to be separate from the nation of Israel right here. He's formed to be a servant to bring Israel back to God.
Let me go back up to
yeah.
Let me see here. Let me read the full chapter for 49. I wanted to see the start of this. I think that there's I understand what you're saying, but I think that this has to do with like the singular and plural uses that we see throughout, not just in Isaiah, but in other areas of the Bible. Usages, right? So like we clearly see examples where the singular and plural are used within Isaiah and it says it's Israel. It's referring to Israel in the singular and plural, right? So in this case, it's more focused in on that singular version, right? And if we didn't have prior passages by the same author defining Israel in the singular, then I'd be like, you may have more of a point. But it's like, you see what I'm saying? It's kind of like,
I agree that Israel can be referred to in the singular. That's fine. I mean, the nation of Israel can be referred to in the singular servant. That's fine. All I'm saying is that like your view accounts for very well for all the instances in which Israel refers to the nation of Israel. But I think my view accounts for both those, because I don't deny that many places are called the servant because they were and are the servant. But because there's a new servant who comes to fulfill what they failed to do.
It accounts for that, but I don't see any evidence that there's anyone other than Jacob Israel who this is referring to.
But can you?
You're just saying like you're saying like we have like almost like a pronoun that's being used like in term for Israel, like servant is a fill-in for either Israel or Jacob, and we see that over and over again in Isaiah. And now you're saying, well, all of a sudden we're just going to assume that that's referring to somebody else who's never mentioned in any of these passages.
Well, it's not assuming that it's not assuming that it's referring to someone else.
Name.
Well, I can't give a specific name, right? But what I'm saying is that it seems like there are two different servants in this passage. Because otherwise, as you said, if Israel is the servant, then why is the servant bringing Israel back to God? Does that make sense? Like, it's an oddity on the view that the servant only ever refers to the nation of Israel. But the view that there are two servants, one righteous servant and one servant that's failed, accounts for this language.
Where do you see that anywhere though in this the failed servant?
Well, you see Israel failing all throughout.
But that's not borne out in this. Like all this stuff comes to fruition in the later passage of Isaiah.
And even what I mentioned before.
That's the other aspect of this that I think you have to account for is like all the things that God's saying He's going to do and all this stuff. This happens later in Isaiah. It all happens. So it's not like this is unfulfilled, and then we have to wait for Jesus to fulfill this. All this stuff is happened. It happens. Cyrus goes through and does what he does. They come back and so forth. They're not a beacon of light to all the nations, but that's whatever. That's
I mean, as far as Israel being a failed servant, you have like in Isaiah 26, they say, we were pregnant, we writhed, but we have given birth to wind. We have accomplished no deliverance on the earth. And so they're talking about how they failed their mission.
Right. I think that's prior to the exile, right? Isn't that like what led them to the exile in the first place? And then they're paying the costs?
Yes, probably in that passage.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is that's so like previously I kind of agreed with you that like the previous passage that I mentioned where it seems like there's two servants, because I said that one is deaf deaf and captive, and the other one opens the ears or opens the eyes and is freeing slaves. That one I agreed, like, yes, there could be room for interpreting that as like the same servant at different points of time, but I think this one's harder to do that with because the servant literally brings Israel back to God. So it's hard to say that the servant brings Israel, who is called the servant, back to God. Like, it's a weird text if you're saying the servant refers to the nation of Israel. And again, I mean, if you want to say
again,
it refers
again, I just don't see the introduction of anyone other than Israel, Jacob in this.
Yeah, I don't think there's an introduction.
I think we should. That's fine. I don't think we're gonna.
I don't think there's an introduction of a specific name, but I think it makes a lot of sense that there are two different servants in mind. But
I suggest to have
but we can continue on if you want.
We can make a checklist for this Jesus check this statement.
Go to chapter 53.
Yeah, we definitely got to get to 53.
Well, actually,
sure.
You shouldn't go to 53. You should go to 52 if you're going to jump anywhere, because that's where it starts.
Right. Let me work my way up there again, just make sure I'm not missing anything.
From?
What's that?
Which perspective?
By the way, 49.3. We were just on 49.3. My servant Israel, in whom I will be glorified. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it
doesn't say Jesus there, but anyway.
Well, no, it doesn't say Jesus. My point is that there are two different servants in the text. One's righteous and one's not righteous. The righteous one brings the unrighteous one back to God. I'm saying that fits well with Jesus.
That's not different, because we know from the pre-exilic period why they weren't righteous. That's part of the Colin, you have to read from Isaiah 1 all the way through this to get the full story of it.
And yes, I have done that.
Like, there's an arc to Israel and its journey and what it did and its redemption. Like, it's being redeemed and by being in exile and by God bringing them out because they fell short of things.
Right.
Right. That's the point. That's the whole point.
Right. That is the point. But I don't think that fixes that the person who is saving them from their failure is the servant. At least one of the servants. So we can move on to other chapters if you want. I would just say too, it's just stopping briefly in chapter 50. I don't think this is like, a knockdown or anything, but like the servant's described as essentially guiltless, asks who will declare him guilty, when all throughout Isaiah we've heard over and over again how guilty and sinful the nation of Israel is.
Well, at the top of it, do you read the top? Where is your mother's bill of divorce, with which I dismissed her?
What verse are you looking at?
50. The beginning of Isaiah 50.
Oh, okay, yeah. Yep.
No, because of your sins you were sold, and for your transgression your mother was sent away.
Right.
It's the backstory.
Right. So what I'm saying is, the servant in this is chapter 50. The servant in 50 verse 9 asks who will declare.
By the way, there is I do want to say, like, there is a change of voice in some of these passages as to like in certain passages, and this has to do with later on in certain passages 53, where what's being described is what the other nations will say about Israel. Right? I am not a biblical scholar, but my understanding from reading biblical scholars is that there is a lot of voice. It's very easy to miss who is speaking in these contexts.
For sure.
Right? Right. So when he talks about, like, this has to do later, especially in like 53 onwards and so forth, but the voice of who's speaking, you're like, wait a second, that doesn't make any sense if it's the same voice, if it's the same individual, if it's God saying this or whomever it is, right? That's kind of the nuance that's needed.
So one other verse I'd like to point out in 50, which I think is really important, is this one. And so it says, who among you fears the Lord and obeys the voice of his servant? Let him who walks in darkness and has no light trust in the name of the Lord and rely on his God. And so what's really interesting about this verse is that I'm sure you know that there's like a parallelism in the Hebrew language, that things that are the same are stated back to back. And so working from the bottom up here, we have trust in the name of the Lord, which is the same as rely on your God. We have him who walks in darkness, which is the same as someone who has no light. And that same logic can be applied to fearing the Lord and obeying the voice of his servant, which I think is just another clue that there's an incarnate servant here. Like the Lord is the servant.
Well, I don't get that from that.
You don't?
Okay. No.
Yeah. So you see how these
you're saying
how
from
these
10,
clauses.
Who among? Yeah, I see what I see what you're saying, but you're saying that that's an incarnate Lord. How do you get an incarnate Lord out of 10?
I'm saying the Lord is equated with the servant because of the structure of Hebrew parallelism, which has two clauses.
I don't agree with that. No, I don't agree with that at all. Yeah,
is there any reason you don't agree with it?
Probably. Yeah, because like you can see other passages that don't fall into that at all. You're saying whenever there's kind of like this rhythmic iambic pentameter to it, where you have a target at the as the last word of it, the second half of that verse is referring to the same subject. That's not.
Well, I'm not saying the last word. I'm saying, like, you see here how it says those who walk in darkness and has no light, or him who walks in darkness has no light. Those are the same. Those mean the exact same
It's
thing.
not the same.
Trust in the name of the Lord and rely on his God. Those mean the exact same thing. I'm saying with how Hebrew uses language a lot, and with these two examples back to back right here, it makes sense that these are the same.
It doesn't, because you're saying who among you, right? So who's the target there? Who among you fears the Lord? So who is he talking to? He's talking to you, being, who is that? Who's the you in that?
I don't know. I have to go back up here. I don't know if it's relevant though, is it? Why would it be relevant? Who the you is there?
I don't see how you get an incarnate God from this, but okay.
What? Yeah, I don't know why it's relevant who the you is, because the same is fearing the Lord.
Think so?
Fear the Lord is paralleled with obeying the voice of the servant. And all I'm saying is, based on these other two, but we can move on. I mean, is there anything else in 50 that you say?
No, not really. I'm still waiting for Jesus to show up, though.
Okay.
Colin.
Obviously, I mentioned this before, but this, just to show you, this is where I was talking about it being similar between the other passage we read where the coastlands will wait for his law, and this one, just in case you wanted to stop there and actually see that. But yeah, the coastlands wait for, in this instance, it's the Lord speaking rather than the servant. The coastlands are waiting for him. A law will go out from him rather than the servant. And so again, it seems like,
Well, wait, it's not the servant speaking in the prior passage, though. It's still God.
It is the servant speaking in the prior passage. What was that, 42?
What it is? It's Israel? Jacob? What?
It's the servant. I'm not specifying which servant it is. I think it's probably the righteous servant, which would fit with Jesus. But yeah, in 42:4 it says.
Okay, where does it say that? Where does it differentiate the righteous servant from the? Where does it make this differentiation between them?
Well, even just in 42, like as I pointed out in verse 7, for instance, it says that the servant opens the eyes of the blind, brings the prisoners out of the dungeon. But then later on in verse 18, 19, it says, "Hear you deaf, you look, and look, you blind, that you may see. Who is blind but my servant, or deaf as my messenger whom I send?" And then later it says they're in captivity.
This is like you're totally ignoring the redemptive aspect of the servant. Like your notion of there being two different servants, one is like the failed one and one is the righteous one, is completely ignoring the narrative of all of Isaiah, which is the redemption of Israel.
I don't think it is. I mean,
it is.
The redemption of Israel is still there.
These passages are about Israel being blind, but then becoming the one who will be seen as the light bringer, as a proxy of God's redemption and glory after being brought out of exile. Because then all the nations will see, wow, look what they went through and what they paid, and this will show the agency and totality of God's glory to all the nations. That's the whole point of Isaiah.
Yeah,
that's what God says over and over again in these passages.
I think you have a lot of that.
You're like bifurcating that. You're just like, oh no, there's no redemption. They failed.
No, there is a
the
redemption.
servant,
Yeah,
but
I agree with a lot of what you're saying. Israel is redeemed, and when they're redeemed, they do begin to fulfill their
And they are the
original
servant.
purpose. Right, and they're the servant. But there's another servant, as in 49:6, where we looked at, that has to bring back the tribes of Jacob and bring back the preserved of Israel before they can fulfill that mission.
All right. We can move on. It's fine.
Yeah. So let me just make sure I'm not missing anything in 51.
I'm just Colin. I still don't see Jesus, but okay. Like, where does it say Jesus?
All I'm saying is that there's two servants so far. One seems to be more righteous
I know,
and
but
bring back the other servant.
I'm
All I'm
not
saying is
seeing
that
two servants here.
that fits well with Jesus, and I think it will make sense of reading Jesus into 53 rather than only a nation of Israel.
But I think you have to ignore the plain words on the page to get that. You have to say. You're saying that Israel. In what way, when you read 53, is that not fulfilled?
Yeah, we can
Israel,
work up to 53.
Israel Jacob. How could that not apply to Israel Jacob?
Let me make sure I'm not missing anything, and then we can
God
work up
is
to 53
good.
pretty quickly.
God is good. God is good.
I mean, like 52. Let Zion rejoice.
Right. That's Jerusalem, right?
Yeah. You were sold for nothing, and you shall be redeemed without money.
Right.
This is Israel, and it says it. Thus says the Lord. Long ago, my
Well,
people
yeah, that
died,
would be
Egypt was
talking
I
about
there. The Assyrian
Israel.
too had oppressed them without cause. Now, therefore, what am I doing here? Says the Lord. Like all these.
What verse are you saying? Oh, I gotta switch to
I'm in
52 on
52.
here. Yeah, you were sold for nothing. Yeah, I mean, this isn't being applied directly to the servant here, so this could just be talking about Israel. I'm sure it is just talking about Israel. My people went down Egypt to sojourn there. So yeah, this passage is talking about Israel, but
the servant.
Yes, it has been the servant in the previous chapters.
It's over and over again, but there's nothing but references to the servant being anyone other than Israel Jacob. That's my point.
Well, except for the ones we covered where it seems like there is a different servant.
But it never says it's anyone other than Jacob or Israel.
But
it says over and over again, God is like, my servant, Jacob Israel, my servant. And
but again,
it does that over and over again.
How does the servant...
Like, oh, all of a sudden somebody else becomes the servant?
But how does the servant bring the servant back to God?
You know what the term retconning is? It's like you're retconning it.
Hey, I don't know what term that means. But anyway, we can move on to I think we're at 53.
Yeah,
or at least
that's where the suffering started.
52:13.
52:13. Yeah.
So yeah, we could talk through this. First thing that I would bring up, unless what would be the first verse you would want to go to, or just
I like Colin. I would guess that at the end of the day, when I read this, and we can stop it here, if you want.
Oh man, I would like to go through 53 at least.
I don't see Jesus anywhere because it never says Jesus. It never says anyone other than Jacob Israel is being defined as the servant. This clearly fits in the total context of not only Deuteronomy Isaiah, but all of Isaiah in terms of what is prophesied as to happen earlier. What they go through is what was prophesied, and then what happens is what was prophesied. It's fulfilled. It's laid out.
And I would agree with all that. So then you're
like, oh no, it was really Muhammad. Muhammad was the servant. That's what it's like to me, Colin. It's like if you were like a Muslim king. Actually, this wasn't about Israel. This was really about Muhammad. That's how crazy this sounds to me. It's like I don't see because you have to completely ignore the storyline and only look at certain passages and ignore all the context of the totality of Isaiah to get to this being someone other than Israel Jacob.
I think that whatever view you take on the servant should try to explain all of the passages, even the difficult ones. And again, I think the servant being Israel explains many of the passages, but I think there are still difficult passages left over, like the 49 one, like the 42 one, where it seems like there is a servant besides Israel, bringing Israel back to God.
Not if you understand the redemptive nature and the transformative nature of what supposedly the storyline says is going to happen to them. That's my...
I'm not sure how that solves it, though.
Okay.
Well, just because Israel is restored, that doesn't answer who restores Israel. And in chapter 49, it's the servant that restores Israel. To bring back the preserved of Israel. That's what the servant does. And so, again, we've gone back to that passage a few times. We can go through 53, or starting with this verse 13 here if you want. The first thing I would look at in 52:13 would be this,
guys,
where it says,
I'm head out.
Okay,
no problem. Yeah.
Thank you, Jess.
Yeah. First thing I would look at here is where it says, "Behold, my servant shall act wisely. He shall be high and lifted up, and shall be exalted." So there's actually two other times this phrase "high and lifted up" is used in Isaiah, and one is at Isaiah 6:1 in Isaiah's calling, and it's referring to God there. He sees the Lord high and lifted up. And then also in 57:15, it's also used of God. And so I just think it's interesting there that the servant there is put on the same plane that use that high and lifted up of him that only ever refers to God in the rest of Isaiah. And so I think, once again, it could be a hint toward an incarnate servant in this instance, or that the servant is God.
Yeah.
Because there's not really an idea that Israel would be on this, high and lifted up like God is.
No, there's reference. No, but I would disagree. That's exactly what he's doing. This goes to, Colin, I think like I think the overarching narrative of this is that Israel is going to be lifted up and on high as a beacon of light to all the nations. That's the entire point of this. That after they've gone through this redemption, that they will be held up as this shining source of light, and they will be seen. It's even, I think it's even exemplified in 53.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that Israel would be high and lifted up. I do think it's still a little bit odd that it would use the language that has been used of God and apply it to the nation of Israel. But it's not impossible. I would agree. It's not impossible. It's just like a clue.
Yeah.
Is there something else? That's all I would bring up from the end of 52 if you want to go to 53.
Actually, hold on a second. Let me. Yeah, it's in 60.
Jumping to 60?
Yeah, like Isaiah 60. Yeah. Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. For darkness shall cover the earth, and thick darkness of the people, but the Lord will arise upon you, his glory will appear over you. Nations shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your dawn. Lift up your eyes and look around. They all gather together. They come to you. Your sons shall come from far away, and your daughters shall be carried in their nurses' arms. Right. Like this is the, this is like the fulfillment of that lifting up, of that redemption, of that light, of that post-exilic return.
Right, and I agree with you. Like I said, what I think my view does is it makes sense of the things yours does and others' things. So, yes, like point of the servant. And you mentioned the
coastlines in 69, by the way. For the coastland shall wait for me, and the ships of Tarshish first, to bring your children from far away, their silver and gold with them.
Yeah.
For the name of the Lord your God, and for the Holy One of Israel, because he has glorified you. Foreigners shall build up your walls, and their king shall minister to you. For in my wrath I struck you down. You see what that's referring to? That's referring to Israel. The wrath of God struck them down. But in my favor I've had mercy on you. Again, referring to Israel. Your gates shall be open day and night, they shall not be shut, so that the nations shall bring their wealth, with their kings led in procession. This is the promise occurring, right? Where it's a further claim of what's going to happen. The glory of Lebanon shall come to you. I would ask Colin for you to read 60 in light of your hypothesis in terms of the language used here and whether it fits. Or at the very least, it certainly applies to Israel, Jacob.
Yeah, I think it would fit. I think it could. Like I said, my reading has space for both Israel as the righteous servant and Israel as the unrighteous servant who is redeemed to be righteous.
Here's another issue, though. In 60:14, when it talks about the descendants, right? Jesus didn't have any descendants. Right?
Right. Yeah, so I could agree that
if Jesus is the servant, huh?
Right, so I could agree that here it's talking about the nation of Israel that has been changed by the obedience of the servant, who in 53 dies on their behalf and forgives their sins. Right, so I mean, you want to go back to 53? I mean, we could end up working all the way up there, but I think 53 will be important for that. Because I mean, that's where I would go to. Like 53 is talking about that servant who will bring Jacob back to God. And how does he do that? It's by being led away, being cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people.
Right. But that's what happened in exile.
Right. So I guess another thing is, yeah. So I guess you would read it as he. Oh, wait, let me go down to verse 8 here. By oppression and judgment he was taken away, and as for his generation, who considers these cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. So it seems like, I'm not saying it's impossible reading, but like it seems like at least a little bit more strained of a reading to say that this is God's people and this is God's people. So who considered that my people was cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgressions of my people? It's a little odd to put it that way. That
53 is using a sacrificial lamb typology.
Right.
He was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement for our peace was put upon him, and by his stripes we are healed.
Yeah. Yeah, so it just seems to read a little bit more naturally that this person being cut off or the people is someone other than the people.
But that whole passage, when you go from by perversion of justice was taken away, they made his grave with the wicked. This is actually described earlier in Isaiah as the procession of when they're let out. Although he had done no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth.
Yeah, which passage are you talking about?
Like when they're actually taken out and sent into exile. I don't remember the exact passages. I'd have to look it up again.
Wait, so in this interpretation, Israel had done no violence and had no deceit in their mouth?
Yeah, I mean, that's another weird thing.
While they were being taken out.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult reading too, like you said, for that reason. I think that's a good point, that like all the way up to this point, when the nation of Israel is talking about, I mean, yes, there are a couple of things here and there, like, you know, you will be redeemed, you will be made sinless, you'll be made holy, stuff like that. But to say that there was, you know, no sin in his mouth, or like, who will call me guilty?
Well, no, that's like, again, that's the historicity of like being taken out into the exile.
Wait,
we have to go all the way back to Isaiah 1 and go through it.
Wasn't sorry for interrupting. Wasn't the exile of Israel due to sin?
Yes.
Due to their unfaithfulness of God?
Yes.
Okay.
So I'm just trying to understand. So if correct me if I'm misspeaking. So Israel was exiled and brought into exile due to a punishment because they have sinned against God, and then here the argument is that Israel had no violence or deceit in their mouth.
Well, it didn't say it. This is not saying they had not done any sin. That's not what this is saying. That's not what 8:9 is saying.
He had done no violence, though, and I mean, because Israel definitely had done violence.
Yeah, and there's a differentiation, by the way. This is a critical thing. There's a differentiation between those who were actually taken out.
You see that?
In terms of exile, and those who committed the sin. This is you who Rashi was?
Yeah.
Yeah, so like a lot of like the Judaic understanding of this is predicated on like a lot of those who came out in exile were not the ones who had done the sins, but they paid over twice for the sins of those prior to them.
Right.
That's clear in this.
So you're kind of moving.
That goes to what we're pointing out here in 8 and 9 and 53.
Well, look, I think there's one big reason why. I mean, that doesn't work. At least. Here, let me get to the right chapter. I think I'm talking about.
Wouldn't it at least be fair to say that that's actually not clear? That you will need to actually.
No, I don't think it. I don't necessarily think that's not clear at all.
So
yeah, we're getting off that.
look,
All right.
so I mean, I would just point back again to this verse, which is obviously an important verse for my interpretation of this. But here, it's the preserved of Israel who are brought back by the servant Israel. So some people think it will help to identify the servant not with just the nation of Israel, but with the preserved or the remnant of Israel. But here again, the servant brings back the tribe of Jacob's and the preserved of Israel. So bring back the preserved. So the people who come out of exile, the servant is bringing them out of exile. And so I'm just saying it's still a difficult reading for that view.
By the way, the headers are, you realize, like, those are not actually in the text.
Right. Yeah.
Those, like, he was pierced for, that's not in the text.
Right.
That's an addition.
But I mean, either
That's
way,
not-
it is the suffering. I mean, the suffering servant's a pretty good.
Sure,
name
I
for
think it's a
whoever the
much
servant is.
more I think it's a much more honest than what you have on the screen was he was pierced for our transgressions.
Yeah.
Like,
So I mean, I feel like we've gone through the text. So I guess just to like wrap up.
well,
I mean,
we didn't
unless
go
you
through
have
any
another-
of the post-exilic stuff, which is what I was referring to, like 60 and where it
Yeah.
it all comes, where it all makes sense in
Yeah.
the context of
So-
those later passages.
and I would agree that like in those later passages, in many of them, we get back to the servant being used of the nation at times, at least, because that servant has been redeemed by the righteous servant. So I don't have a problem with the later passages.
I don't see
Israel.
I don't see how 60 can apply to Jesus as the servant. That's what I'm getting.
How 60 could apply to Jesus as a servant. I mean, it could or it could not. I have to read over that one again. I think it's more likely referring primarily to the nation of Israel in that instance, because I mean, you see there that they're not the light; they're reflecting the light, right? So there's that idea in chapter 60 of the servant reflecting the light, whereas the righteous servant in 49, there isn't so much that idea. It's just that the nations have seen a great light. I'm not saying that's like a knockdown thing, but I think it's interesting that of the nation of Israel, it's that they're reflecting light specifically. And of what I think is the righteous servant, it's more he is a great light, which is what God is described as.
Well, hang on. Read 60 again. Read 61 through 3. Nations shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your dawn.
Right, yeah. And
he's talking about Zion. This is all about Israel.
Yeah, where was the you read the verse earlier that
60,
made it clear
60,
that was a
The
reflection,
ingathering of the dispersed. Isaiah 60.
right? Mm-hmm.
Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. Your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you.
Yeah. Right. So
And then and they go on, and then here's the thing: if you're going to say, well, it's Jesus's light in 1 through 3, but then it says, lift up your eyes and look around. They all gather together to come to you. Your sons shall come from far away, and your daughters shall be carried in their nurses' arms. This is referring to the nations, the nation of Israel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think verse 1 is definitely like the light of the Lord, right? And the glory of the Lord has risen upon you.
But it says, your light has come.
Right. Yeah. Which verse is that? That's
the first. It's 61. 60.
Yeah. Yeah, but again, those things are paralleled. Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has arisen upon you. Like those things.
This is where it's not God's
with each
light.
other.
It's not saying God's light. It's saying it's referring to your light.
I would say it is
And
God's
it's
light.
Israel's
I mean, your
light to the other nations.
Yeah, but your light could. I mean, yes, grammatically, that could refer to a light emanating from you, or it could refer to the light that has come from outside of you to you. And I think it's more likely to be the latter because, again, the second clause. No, the second. See, The second clause
Doesn't say
here
king.
is the same as the first, and it's the glory of the Lord has risen upon you, which is much
But
more
nations
clear.
shall come
It's
to
still
your
gonna-
light, and
I
kings
don't
to the
think-
brightness of your dawn.
Right,
I don't
and I
think it's
think
talking about
that's
the
where
light
this idea
straight
of
away,
like
but-
reflection comes from. Like they have light because God has shined upon them. Right? Like it's not a light that's intrinsic to Israel. It's
I know,
a light
but
from God.
You're saying this is Jesus.
No, I'm not saying all of 60 is Jesus. I'm saying a lot of 60 is the people of Israel, but they've been redeemed in their purpose. Now they can reflect, take the light to the nations. But that light is Jesus, or is the Lord at the very least, who is Jesus.
All right, well, that's fine. I appreciate going through this stuff.
Yeah, that was fun. I've never actually gone. I've studied it a lot, and I've watched debates and stuff, but I've never actually like gone through it with someone who was skeptical. So,
What are we talking about?
I mean, again, I guess probably the main verse again I would go back to is 49,
but
5 through
okay,
6. But
you got to kind of. I would say you got to go through every other verse and explain away why Israel, where it says over and over again, why Israel, Jacob, who is referred to as the servant, is no longer the servant anymore.
right, but it's
I
not
think
that they're
it's
not the
just-
servant anymore. It's that they are the servant. They're the chosen servant, but they failed in their mission, and so a servant.
Where is that? Where do you see a bifurcation? Like, besides what that one point, where does it say where God says, you are no longer the servant? The servant will be some future messianic figure that's
Well,
going to come in.
I'm not saying that they're no
anything
longer
that's
the servant.
relevant to a Messiah or a messianic figure is Cyrus. That's clear in 45:1. Cyrus is the one who brings them out. So, are you saying Jesus is really Cyrus, or
let me just
and
ask.
it was mistaken?
Let me just
About,
ask,
like,
for
when
your
it said
opinion on
Cyrus?
this. Is this servant right here in verse 5? Is that
I can't see what you're
synonymous?
referring to
Oh,
on
shoot.
Your screen. Your screen is frozen.
Sorry, in 49:5, when it says, "And now the Lord says, He who formed me from the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob back to him, and that Israel might be gathered to him." And then later it says, "It is too light a thing that you should be my servant." This is in verse 6, to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to bring back the preserved of Israel. I guess what I really want to know from you is the servant in verse 5 and 6, is that synonymous with Israel and Jacob? Or is it referring to a different person, group? Is it referring to something other than the nation of Israel?
Well, are you saying it's the Messiah?
I'm saying it must be referring to someone other than Israel. That's all I'm trying to.
Actually,
All I'm trying to get your opinion on is this servant in verse 5 and 6 referring to Israel or someone other than Israel, the nation?
Which chapter?
49, 5 and 6.
hello.
See, here's the thing. 6, if you read 6, Colin, that is what 60 is all about.
Mm-hmm.
So
You have to-
you have to
You have to.
you have to understand.
You
I
have to-
think you have to consider 60
You have a
in the context also of. You done?
Okay.
6-year-olds. Right? Like, do you see the parallel between what they're saying in 6 is the
Mhm.
exact thing in 60 that happens?
Yeah, I agree that that light, I mean, the idea of the servant being light, yes, is applied to the servant here and also to the
I will
servant.
also make you a light for the Gentiles, in terms of, that my
But-
salvation may reach the ends of the earth. That is the point of 60.
Yeah, but so
Right?
like, I still feel like I need an answer to this. Do you think the servant here,
What do you mean? I don't know. I've got to read more on it. I've
yeah.
got to go back to.
and that's where I would say, like, I just don't think it doesn't seem to make much sense here, and there's other places too, but that I've mentioned, but this is the clearest one, I think, where like
Yeah,
the servant seems differentiated from Jacob because he's bringing back Jacob from Israel.
Colin, I see your point. I will look more into it, but I like if this is your strongest thing, I think you're just wholesale ignoring so many passages to get that this is Jesus. Like it just seems to be dishonest to me.
Actually, I've got to speak up after that one. I feel like one thing that you mentioned, which I thought was a little bit contradictory. You said that there was some sort of like bifurcation also of the people of Israel, where the people who get exiled are not necessarily the same people who sinned, and I don't see how that was properly justified. So if you can come at him for kind of making some
Rangos, I was referring to prior passages that we haven't even discussed in here. And I was also referring to like Rashi and other writers on this in regards to the interpretation of like our understanding in terms of biblical scholarship on that concept.
Sure, but those people did not write the scriptures. At the end of the day, we have to go by what is written in here. If we had the people who actually wrote,
Rangos, no offense, but you haven't heard any of the background to this. Like, and we've gone through repeatedly sections that talked about. The suffering servant is this individual and this nation, and the basis of our discrepancy between the two of us is he's saying it's Jesus, and I'm saying there's no evidence for that anywhere. It's a typology that you have to infer, reading between the lines and ignoring the plain definitional meaning.
Technically,
in the scripture of who the servant is.
I would just like to say, to clarify my view, I'm not saying, it says it's Jesus. I'm saying that it seems clear that there are at least two different servants here. One seems to be portrayed as righteous, one seems to be portrayed as unrighteous. When you take that into context and you get to chapter 53,
I don't think that's clear at all.
It opens the reading to fit Jesus very well, because 53 almost undeniably sounds like Jesus.
Colin, here's the problem. Yeah. It fits anybody you could insert as a typology.
Does it?
Into being the manifestation.
No.
Do you want to know why? Do you want to know why? Because I'll tell you why. Because when you go to Matthew and you see what Matthew says about these passages, it's just fucking wrong. Like when Matthew talks about Isaiah 7. It's embarrassingly wrong. Do you know what I'm referring to?
I would like to stick to 53.
Isaiah 7:14.
Can you tell me, like, for example, how would Muhammad fit Isaiah 53, or how would Joseph Smith fit Isaiah 53?
I'm saying when I look at this stuff, I look what the contextual understanding is of those who wrote this and what their belief.
Yeah, me too.
I'm not. And with a typology, it's almost predicated on ignoring that understanding. You have to. It's not just reading between the lines; it's ignoring the lines and then reading between the lines.
No, I'm reading the lines and seeing that there are two different servants.
It doesn't say that. It does never. Where does it say? Give me a single passage where it says there are two different servants. It says.
How else can you read 49?
You are my servant. Again, Colin. All right.
How else can you read these verses?
Colin, we've had a very good conversation up to this point, and I've asked you repeatedly. Show me where it says. In this passage where it's defined, the servant is defined anything other than Israel and Jacob. And there's like 9 times where it says, you, my servant, Jacob, Israel, over and over and over again. I'm not cooking that up out of nowhere, man.